In a forgotten valley where the river bends sharply against the limestone cliffs, there is a story the locals dare not write down. They speak of it only when the night is heavy and the lamps burn low, as if the darkness itself listens, waiting to catch them in the telling. They call her the Hollowed Bride, a woman whose name has slipped through generations like water through rotten wood, but whose sin clings to the land like smoke that refuses to clear. The valley holds little now but rusted farm tools, crumbling chimneys, and a church whose bell cracked in the 1890s and never rang again. Travelers pass by without knowing what happened there. But the elders, those who still lean on porches and spit tobacco into the dust, know. They remember her, the bride who bore not only her husband's children, but the twisted offspring of her father's brother, and later her own brother's son. It began, they say, with silence. A family too proud to marry outside their blood, too fearful of strangers who might claim their land, too bound by a belief that their line was chosen, special, meant to remain untouched by outsiders. The bride was no different, raised in a house where walls sweated from candle soot and scripture was twisted into something unrecognizable. She was taught that obedience was salvation, and that to stray from the blood was to betray the family's very soul. Her wedding came without music, without guests, without joy. Inside the collapsing church, lit only by oil lamps, her father's brother stood waiting. He was old, grey in beard and bent in back, but the family said it was his right. She wore white, not from choice, but because her mother had preserved the dress for years, folded carefully in a chest that smelled of mold. When she walked down the aisle, she did not look at the man who would become her husband. She looked only at the floorboards, worn smooth by generations of feet that had carried the same sin before her. No paper recorded the union. No preacher dared put his name to it, and yet the people in that valley knew what had happened. They whispered that her cries were heard for nights after, muffled through the thin clapboard walls of the cabin, cries that blended with prayers too broken to be understood. Months later, she bore a child whose features unsettled even the elders. Skin too pale, eyes set too far apart, a face that seemed like a reflection bent in water. But the story did not end there. The family kept her bound, kept her body as property, kept the bloodlines circling tighter. Years later, when her own brother's son grew to manhood, they said the elders declared it was time again. She was to marry him too, bear him children, and seal the family's fate a second time. Some neighbors swore they saw the two figures by the river at dusk, his hand gripping her arm, her head turned away, as though even the water itself recoiled at what was demanded of her, and through it all the land grew stranger. The valley seemed to lean inward, trees twisted toward the cabin as though eavesdropping. Birds avoided the place, their silence louder than song, and those who passed near the graveyard behind the church swore they heard a woman's voice in the wind, low, steady, repeating vows no sane union would ever speak. To outsiders, it is only rumor, another story in a land heavy with forgotten tragedies. But to those who have walked that valley at night, it is more. They say the bride's face still peers from the broken windows of the cabin. They say the earth itself remembers her footsteps, and that no grass will grow where she once knelt to pray for freedom. And perhaps the most chilling whisper is this, that her children never left. Not all of them, at least. Some are buried there, their graves swallowed by weeds. Others still walk among us. In counties across the Midwest, records were once kept with obsessive precision, births inked into Bibles, deaths carved into stone, marriages neatly logged in courthouse ledgers that smelled of leather and dust. But in the valley where the Hollowed Bride lived, those records stutter and vanish, as though the pages themselves recoiled from her story. The courthouse in town holds shelves of marriage registers from the 1800s, each entry penned in careful cursive. Yet when you flip to the year of the bride's first union, a page is missing, torn clean, leaving only ragged fibers where ink should have testified. A clerk once swore she saw the entry there. Bride, name blurred, groom, the father's brother. But when she returned the next day, it was gone. The church was no better. Ministers in that region took pride in their thick baptismal books, pages swollen with holy water stains, every soul accounted for. But the book that should have named the bride's children has long since disappeared. Some whisper it was hidden by the minister himself, who later confessed to a traveling preacher that he had blessed a marriage no man should have blessed, and feared his book would condemn him. Days later, the minister fell ill and died without sermon or hymn, his grave left unmarked by the very flock he once led. Neighbors filled the silence with their own recollections. They remembered the bride walking to the river with her belly swollen, her eyes downcast, a pale figure against the black water. They remembered children who grew pale and frail, who rarely spoke above whispers, who called their mother sister and their uncle father. Outsiders chalked it up to mountain ignorance, but those who lived near knew it was no mistake. The family tree was no tree at all. It bent back on itself, twisted into knots, each branch circling toward the same root. Teachers, too, left fragments of testimony. One schoolmistress wrote of a girl whose surname matched her mother's maiden name exactly, a girl who trembled whenever asked to describe her father. She looked at me with terror in her eyes, the teacher wrote, as though to answer would invite a punishment worse than death. Another teacher kept a census book where a child was listed as son, only for the same child to appear in the following year's column as nephew, and later, stepchild. The doctors who ventured into the valley left more chilling notes. A physician recorded a child born with fused fingers, another with a chest so narrow it rattled with every breath. Consanguinity, he wrote in a private ledger, too ashamed to submit his findings to the county health board. Another noted that the line folds too close, his handwriting shaky, the phrase underlined twice as though to emphasize what his conscience could not. And then there were the artifacts. A Bible found in the ruins of the cabin, its front pages torn out, its marriage records missing. A photograph tucked inside, blurred at the edges, but the bride unmistakable. White dress, hollow eyes, standing beside a man much older, his arm gripping her wrist instead of holding her hand. And later, another photo found in a neighbor's attic, the same bride years older standing beside her brother's son. His youth made her seem ancient, and yet the caption scratched into the back read only, husband and wife, 1897. Still, the land itself may be the most damning witness. Travelers speak of fog that descends without warning, smothering the valley until even lanterns burn dim. Hunters describe hearing voices carried across the river, chanting words they cannot understand. A farmer swore he saw children gathered in a circle near the church ruins, their hands clasped, their eyes closed, humming in unison while no adult stood near. When he shouted, they scattered like smoke, vanishing into the trees. The deeper one looks into the story, the more it resists clarity. The bride's name changes depending on who tells it. Some say she was meek, broken by her elders. Others claim she embraced her role, convincing herself it was holy. But all agree on this. Her unions were not chance, not love, not mistake. They were ritual, an arrangement to keep blood bound to blood, no matter the cost. And though the ledgers may lie, and the church may hide its shame, the whispers have never ceased. Because in that valley, truth is not written in ink or carved in stone, it is written in blood. And blood never forgets. There are stories that cling like a shadow, too grotesque to forget once heard. The tale of the hollowed bride is one such story, not a simple union gone astray, but a spiral of marriages and births that bent natural law into something foul. To hear it spoken in detail is to feel the weight of rot, to sense a sickness in the blood, the marrow, the soil itself. The first union between the bride and her father's brother was the beginning of that rot. He was no ordinary man of age, but a patriarch whose presence dominated the family. His voice was gravel, his hands leathered from fields, but it was his eyes that froze those around him. Flat, cold, seeing not flesh, but possession. When he declared the girl his bride, the family did not resist. Some say her father even nodded approval, believing his brother better suited to guard the line than an outsider. Her wedding night was remembered in whispers. The cabin walls, thin as paper, carried her cries out into the stillness of the valley. Neighbors spoke of hearing muffled sobs turn into prayers. prayers into silence. For months she lived as his wife, though more prisoner than partner. He fed her scripture twisted beyond recognition, lines bent to justify desire. He said their blood was chosen, set apart, too sacred to mingle with others. To break that order, he warned, was to invite damnation. The child she bore from this union came weak and malformed. The midwife who delivered him, an old woman whose tongue was sharp and fearless, was said to mutter, "This is not a child fit for the Lord's earth." The infant's eyes were set too far apart, his lips split by a cleft that never healed. The midwife urged the bride to take the child and run, to flee the valley before the family consumed her completely. But the bride stayed. Or perhaps she could not leave, bound by fear, bound by the iron grip of her husband's will. Years passed and her husband grew feeble. When he died, some thought she might finally be free. But freedom was not for her. The elders of the family gathered again, and once more they twisted scripture into command. The bride was not to leave, they said. Her duty was not finished. The bloodline was not yet secure. And so her body was offered again, this time to her own brother's son. He was younger than she, a boy she had once seen toddle barefoot by the river, chasing minnows in the shallows. Now he was grown, though still awkward, his eyes too innocent for the role forced upon him. Yet the elders declared it was his right, and hers was the burden to carry. The wedding was quieter than the first, with fewer witnesses, fewer lamps, as though the valley itself was tired of watching. This second union was stranger still. The bride, now older, stood beside her nephew, who barely understood the vows he repeated. She wore the same white dress, yellowed with time, patched at the seams. Some say she wept through the ceremony. Others say she was silent, her face as blank as stone. What all agreed upon was this: the marriage was consummated. And soon after she bore him children. The children of this union carried the weight of generations folded too tightly. One boy was born with limbs twisted, unable to walk without crawling like an animal. A girl arrived with eyes clouded white, blind from birth. Another child, stillborn, was buried in the churchyard with no stone to mark the grave. And those who survived were not spared. Neighbors recalled them muttering to themselves, rocking in corners, or singing in voices far too old for their age. Rumors spread that the bride herself had begun to change. She grew thin, her skin gray as though the valley itself had seeped into her veins. Her hair fell in clumps, yet her belly swelled again and again, a cruel cycle repeating. Some swore they saw her wandering near the graveyard at night, barefoot in the frost, whispering names of children long buried. Others claimed she carried on conversations with no one, her voice steady, her face serene, as though speaking to spirits no one else could see. The family, desperate to hide their shame, began pulling away from the town. They stopped attending church. They stopped sending their children to school. They bartered less, hunted more, relying on the valley alone. Visitors to the cabin spoke of an air so thick it made their lungs ache, of shadows that seemed to move, even when lanterns burned bright. One traveler swore he saw a figure in the loft of the cabin, small, pale, watching him through the slats. When he asked the bride how many children she had, she only replied, "More than I can name." Over time, the valley itself grew notorious. Cattle born there were said to come weak, calves unable to stand. Crops withered in midsummer, their stalks bending as if under unseen weight. Hunters who followed deer trails into the hollow spoke of finding strange markings on trees, circles carved deep, filled with ash. One hunter claimed to find a clearing where children's shoes were arranged in pairs, too many to belong to a single family, yet no children were in sight. The cycle did not stop with her. Some whispers claimed the bride's children, once grown, took cousins as wives and husbands, repeating what had been done to their mother. It became a pattern, marriages unspoken, ceremonies unblessed, births that blurred the meaning of kinship. Outsiders who inquired were told to mind their own bloodlines, that what the valley did with its own was none of their business. And the bride herself? She became less woman, more symbol. To some she was victim, trapped in chains of blood. To others she was betrayer, the one who allowed the sickness to spread. And to the valley she was both sinner and saint. Mother and sister, bride and widow, forever circling roles until no one could tell where one ended and another began. Even in death, her story refused peace. Some say she was buried beside her children, her grave sinking faster than the earth around it, as though the soil could not bear her. Others say she was never buried at all, that her body was sealed in the cabin, walls nailed shut, the house left to rot around her bones. Travelers who dare camp nearby claim to hear scratching in the night, slow and steady, as if fingernails rake the wood still. The disturbing truth is this: the hollowed bride's tale is not singular. It is part of a pattern, an echo in valleys and hollows across the country, where blood was bound too close, where silence was stronger than law, where sin wore the mask of tradition. Her story lingers because it was not hers alone. It was a warning whispered down the years, that once a family bends too far inward, it collapses, and its ruin stains the land forever. The hollowed bride's story should have ended with her death. The grave should have closed the matter, the soil pressed down, the whispers silenced. But in that valley, nothing truly ended. The curse lingered, not in words alone, but in the marrow of the place itself, as though her suffering was carved into the stones, the trees, the very air. Travelers who strayed into the hollow long after the family line had withered spoke of unease that settled over them like a damp shroud. The silence there was never natural. No bird call, no cricket chirp, only the soft groan of trees bending in wind that seemed too still to move them. Lantern light faltered in that place, flames shrinking as if choked by unseen hands. Those who stayed too long reported hearing a woman's voice carried low across the ground, steady, mournful, repeating vows that no scripture had ever known. Local children, warned to stay away, dared one another to run up to the ruined cabin. Those who entered returned pale, unwilling to speak of what they saw. A boy once muttered of a rocking chair moving on its own, of a cradle swaying through empty, of footsteps pacing overhead in a loft long collapsed. Another swore he saw the bride herself, grey-skinned, hair hanging in strings, her arms reaching as if to pull him into her breast. When he screamed, the vision vanished, leaving only the stench of earth freshly turned. The graveyard behind the church did not escape her shadow. Stones there cracked and leaned, inscriptions worn smooth as if by hands constantly caressing them. Some said that on autumn nights, when the mist rolled low, they could see pale figures kneeling at the unmarked plots. The figures did not rise, did not move, but their lips worked ceaselessly, whispering words the living could not hear. Dogs refused to enter the graveyard. They howled and dug their claws into the dirt rather than cross its threshold. Folklore grew around her, as folklore always does. The hollowed bride became a warning whispered to young girls: marry outside the blood, or she will take you in your sleep. Others swore she wandered the valley searching for her children, her shadow long and crooked against the moonlight, her voice soft but insistent. Come back to me, little ones. Come back. Some claimed that those who ignored the warning and married within their own kin were cursed to dream of her, standing at the foot of their bed, eyes hollow, whispering vows until dawn. The most chilling stories came from those who traced their lineage back to the hollow. A family in the nearby town claimed their daughter woke each night at the same hour, her mouth moving in vows she did not understand, her voice not her own. Another man claimed his newborn son bore the same cleft lip as the bride's first child, though the deformity did not run in either side of his family. He burned his family Bible after finding the hollowed bride's name scrawled faintly in its margins, though none could explain how it got there. Over time, the valley emptied. The cabin fell into ruin, the church collapsed, the graveyard swallowed by weeds. But the land was never reclaimed. Farmers refused to till it. Hunters avoided its borders, even surveyors marked the ground as barren. When a mining company tried to buy the rights, their first drilling machine broke within hours. Its gears twisted as though forced by unseen hands. Workers refused to return, swearing they heard children's laughter echoing from the trees. And so, the valley sits untouched, a scar in the landscape. Those who drive the old road that skirts its edge still roll up their windows and whisper prayers. They say the mist that rises from the hollow is not mist at all, but the breath of the bride still searching, still waiting, still bound to the curse that claimed her body and her blood. Her story endures not because it was unique, but because it revealed something too many would rather forget: that sin does not vanish when the sinner is buried. It festers, it seeps into wood and water, it carries through blood until it is not only remembered but lived again. The hollowed bride's curse is not hers alone. It belongs to all who believe blood is a chain instead of a bond, to all who confuse possession with love, to all who mistake silence for salvation. And perhaps that is why, even now, those who speak her name lower their voices, because in the valley where she once walked, vows were made that could never be broken. They bind still, tighter than earth, tighter than death. And if you listen too closely in that place, you may hear her whispering to you too, asking for a vow in return, a vow you cannot unmake,